Okay. Hello everyone. This is Sharonna from Team Voyages into the Past, Otit Probaho, and today we are presenting to you our first crossover session. We are extremely fortunate to have with us Professor Rajmohan Gandhi, who is a stalwart historian and biographer. He is currently serving as research professor at the College of Education, the University of Illinois. Professor Gandhi has authored many books on the prominent figures associated with Indian nationalism and freedom struggle, as well as many more on South Asian history. In 2002, he received the Sahitya Akademi Award for Rajaji, a biography of Chakravarti Rajagopalachari. We are also very grateful to Dr. Pratyay Nath, Assistant Professor of History at Ashoka University, for kindly accepting our request to host this lecture. Pratyay Nath is a historian of the Mughal Empire, interested particularly in environment, warfare, and kingship of the period. After his first book, Climate of Conquest, published from Oxford University Press in 2019, he is now working on his second monograph titled War and the Region, which concerns much about the military techniques under Akbar. He is also editing a journal for JESHO and co-editing a volume on periodization of history for Cambridge University Press and another on the evolution of debates on South Asian history for Ananda Publishers. So now, without any further delay, I would like to pass the session on to Pratyay sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharna. And a very good evening to all of you. And a very good morning to Professor Gandhi, who is joining us today from the US. And we are delighted on behalf of Voyages Crossover to have you with us today, Professor Gandhi. Let me begin by asking you and requesting you to tell us a little bit about your intellectual journey. This is, of course, something that perhaps needs a much longer time frame. But having you with us today, I can't resist myself from asking this question. If you could begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and the long years of your activity. And I think and then we can take up some of the questions that we have gathered.
Thank you. Well, I also appreciate the chance to be at this interaction, this virtual interaction. I know that some students who are taking part perhaps are having exams, so I give them my best wishes for those exams as well. I'm very glad that we're having this session. Now, you're asking about my journey. You know, all human journeys, every single human journey, extremely interesting. And I suppose mine is no exception. I've written quite a few biographies. And in addition to writing these biographies, I'm most of the time interested in people and interested in almost every person I meet or run into. And my curiosity when I meet somebody is to ask them all kinds of questions. And sometimes I ask almost, some people may imagine them to be invasive questions. I want to ask about the past. And as I sometimes say, that every human being is worth a biography. And since not everybody has a biography written about them, some of these quote unquote ignored personalities sometimes enter into our lives through novels. They figure in other ways, so we run into them. But nonetheless, it is a fact that we ignore many human beings around us, and we are blind to the richness that they contain, or their stories contain, the joys and the sorrows that their lives contain. Now, my intellectual life. So I was raised in Delhi. My father, Gandhiji's fourth and youngest son, was a journalist. He was the editor of the Hindustan Times for many years. So that's where I went to school and then to college. I didn't have a clear idea at a young age of what I would do as an older person. I was content to take life as it came. I didn't have a particular drive. I did reasonably well in school and in college too. In college, my subjects were economics mainly and mathematics secondarily. I was at St. Stephen's College, Delhi. I was very lucky to be there. And I had some wonderful professors. And then I somehow got involved in efforts to change the world. And I came across this idea that if you want to change the world, you should start by changing yourself. That's the only reasonable or logical way of changing the world. So at a fairly young age, I threw myself into this effort to change India and the world, starting with myself. And I suppose related to that attempt was starting by me in association with some of my friends and colleagues of a journal called Himmat in 1964. So whereas my work of changing society and the world by changing people, starting with myself, was quote unquote non-political. It is non-political. I also felt the need to express myself on current political questions. And that is why I was keen that there should be this journal called Himmat. And although it was called Himmat, which is a Hindi or an Urdu or a Hindustani name, the journal was in the English language. And we tried to address what we felt were the burning issues of the time in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s. The journal did not last beyond 81, but for 17 years, it played a very useful and interesting part. And we had the privilege of opposing the emergency in the mid-70s, 75 to 77, which was an interesting period in India. And fortunately, it only lasted for 19 months. But it was a very interesting period in India's story. Now, in 72, Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, my other grandfather, my mother's father, died at the old age of 94. And a year thereafter, or some months thereafter, some associates of his, admirers of his, asked me if I would write his biography. When I was introduced, it just mentioned that I got the Sahitya Akademi Award for the biography of Rajagopalachari. It is true. But these group of people who asked me to write the biography said to me, one of them said to me, that we want you to do this because we know that you will also be willing to criticize Rajagopalachari if you felt the need arises. I took that as a tribute. But that was my first attempt. I had been writing journalistically, started this weekly paper. So the Rajagopalachari biography was my first serious study. But that was my, as I sometimes say, that I've been on history's boat ever since. So I've written different books of different kinds, many of them biographies, some of them that might be classified under the rubric of history. Although sometimes people do call me a historian, I don't feel that I am. I feel I'm a student of history. Historian is a very big word, but I don't always object. I don't always say, please delete that word. But I have to say I feel uncomfortable because trying to understand the past is such a business. And to suggest that a historian understands it and can summarize it, can offer a meal called history as a dish to people is really a very tall claim. And nonetheless, so I wrote several biographies, but I did write some things that were more than biographies. One of the books that I love any student to read, of course, is a book called Revenge and Reconciliation. It's a broad overview of Indian history, very broad overview, from the Mahabharata and the Buddha's time to modern times. It was written in the late 1990s. So it covered the Kargil War, ended with that very briefly. But it's called Revenge and Reconciliation, and it suggests that. Anyway, I'm taking too long. So, and then there was this history of Punjab that I wrote, Undivided Punjab, which I was fortunately able to write. People have forgotten there was a thing called Undivided Punjab, Undivided Bengal. I wish I could write Undivided Bengal also, but I couldn't. But I've written about Undivided Punjab, 240 years of story of Punjab. And then more recently, I wrote this history of modern South India, Telugu area, Kannada area, Tamil area, Malayalam area, Tulu area, Konkani area. So of course it's an arbitrary line, which is north, which is south, but I drew an arbitrary line. 400 years of South Indian history. That was my latest book. Another effort to understand history was a book called A Tale of Two Revolts, in which it was a comparative history. I wrote about India 1857 and the American Civil War, which, although it only started in 61, it had its genesis in the Dred Scott judgment of 56 and 57, I think. And so anyway, I wanted to know what Indians in the 1850s thought about America's Civil War and what Americans at that time thought about India 1857. I wanted to know whether Lincoln had any comment on the Indian revolt. So I'm very glad that I was able to do this book called A Tale of Two Revolts. So anyway, these are some of my studies of history. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. I have so many questions about what all you just said, but I will hold the horses for the moment. And of course, you have called yourself, in all humility, a student of history, where we know that you are one of the most eminent historians of our times. And we will wait for that book on the history of Undivided Bengal from you, which. But let me come now to some of the questions that we have already gathered. And there are several, and I've taken the liberty of sort of grouping them under some rubrics. And what you've also mentioned is that in you thinking about history, one prominent route that you have taken is the route of writing biographies. So the first set of questions actually concerns Mr. M.K. Gandhi. And I'll just read out the three questions that we have there, and perhaps you could respond to them collectively. So the first question was the notion of ahimsa and satyagraha of M.K. Gandhi linked with Vedanta philosophy? And if you could comment on those linkages. The second is a quote from Periyar, and this is about him suggesting that India should be named Gandhi Nadu. And the question asks you to comment on EVR's view of Gandhi before and after his death. And the third question is about how M.K. Gandhi is perceived in our own times, and the way that during the Black Lives Matters movement, how a statue of Gandhi was vandalized. And there was a lot of arguments both in favor of and against this act. And the question asks for your views about Gandhi vis-a-vis racism in his own times. So these are the three questions under this rubric.
Sure. Well, I'll attempt some responses. And for a start, I would just like to remind everybody, all students of history are aware of this, but a reminder is perhaps good, that unlike, say, mathematics or poetry, where dates and contexts are not all that important, a mathematical equation of any kind, not just 2 + 2, any mathematical equation normally does not need a date or a place. Similarly, a wonderful line from poetry of any kind. The quality of mercy is not strained, or Ekta Chalove, or any line of poetry does not really need a time, a date, or a place. But when we're dealing with historical figures or with events in the past, and we're dealing with events in the past and we want to understand, we also want to compare situations, we want to compare personalities, we want to compare countries, then I think when we then make use of statements or comments on statements, it's essential to keep dates and places and circumstances in mind. So context is absolutely, utterly crucial. So for any understanding of history. So those are some preliminary remarks. So let me start with this question about ahimsa and satyagraha, two concepts rightly identified with Gandhi. And the question is, so where did Gandhi get these ideas? Did Gandhi get them from Vedanta, from Hindu spiritual text? So historically, I want to remind people of how it happened in Gandhi's case. Now, Gandhi states there's no reason to doubt this, that as a school child, he came across a poem by a poet called Shyamal Bhatt, which spoke about returning any evil deed with a good deed. If somebody gives you a glass of water, then you should give them next time a proper meal. So Gandhi says, and there's no reason to doubt this, that the first time that he sort of got this idea, which he later called himsa, which he refined also or converted into a weapon called Satyagraha, was through this poem by Shyamal Bhatt when Gandhi was 10, 11, 12, or whatever he said. We also know that when he was a student in London, between the ages of 18 and 21, and this is not only from his own account, but we also know from his conversations with people in England at the time. This man, James Hunt, has written a remarkable book about Gandhi in London at that time. So there's no doubt that Gandhi read the Bible before he read the Gita. Most people are not aware of this. So he does say that the Sermon on the Mount went straight to his heart when he was 18 or 19. So this is another injection of the idea of nonviolence or ahimsa or forgiveness. And then we know that he had this very interesting interaction when he returned from England to India with this Jain poet as well as a thinker. He was also a jeweler, a very remarkable man called Srimad Rajchandra in Mumbai. And Gandhi, he was only 3 years older than Gandhi, but the two became very close friends for a very short time because Rajchandra would die very soon. But they became very close friends. And Rajchandra also seems to have given some thoughts about ahimsa. And around this time, we don't know this, but at some point early on, Gandhi read Patanjali's sutras. Now, those who have studied the Hindu texts know that sutras, which go back a very long time, speak of ahimsa paramo dharma. Ahimsa paramo dharma. So ahimsa, of course, it's well known that in the Jain text and the Buddhist text and in ancient Hindu texts, ahimsa is there. When exactly Gandhi first came across it, no, but fairly early, in his late teens or early 20s, he would have come across Patanjali's sutras, his famous text, where ahimsa. Then he soon goes to South Africa when he's 23. Before he goes to South Africa, he has some very difficult experiences with the British imperialist political agent in Rajkot, a very important encounter in Gandhi's life. Most people have tended to neglect it, but I think it's supremely important. This is just before he goes to South Africa, where he's very rudely treated by this man. He's kicked out of. So So there Gandhi faces, and then soon in South Africa, he faces many people are familiar with this, being tossed out of the railway train and stuff. So he faced with ejection, with humiliation, with insults. So Gandhi is responding to this, to what happened in Rajkot. He went to South Africa, then succession. He's wrestling with how to deal with humiliation, insults, attacks on himself and on other Indians. So there, eventually, he comes to this conclusion that satyagraha, non-violent resistance, direct action, is the response. So all these real life experiences, in addition to what he reads, are also contributing to the evolution of ahimsa and satyagraha in him. And then there is this very important reading he does early in South Africa when he's 24 of Tolstoy's book, which is a very important formative impact also in his life. And then I won't go into the detail, but there is this very interesting experience in 1906, the Zulu revolt, Gandhi's very interesting role in it. But this is where satyagraha kind of takes place as an idea. And very soon satyagraha is then implemented in South Africa. So these readings and these experiences lead to ahimsa and satyagraha in Gandhi's mind. And before long, he finds affirmation, confirmation for these also in the Hindu texts, in the Upanishads, especially the Isha Upanishad, and in the Gita. But historically, if you want to understand the evolution or the emergence of ahimsa and satyagraha, I've described some of the steps on that journey. So for that question, I will stop there. So his South African days, because already we have touched on those, it's a very important question. And it is undoubtedly true that some remarks that Gandhi has made about Africans in his early days in South Africa, which are very sad, unfortunate remarks. He should not have made them, but he did make them. But it's important to note the context in which he made them. So he made those remarks when he was fighting for some minimal rights for Indians in South Africa. And he was comparing what he felt were the abilities of the Africans. He made some unfortunate comparisons, unfortunate remarks. So this was the context in which he made those remarks. And of course, what is also important to notice, the kind of remarks he made were remarks that were made at the time by every Indian in South Africa. Remarks at the time that were being made almost by every Indian in India. I mentioned my Tale of Two Revolts, and I wanted to study Indian attitudes to slavery in America. Very, very, very few Indians at that time made public criticisms of slavery in the United States. Even Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, even Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, it's very hard to find out comments by them about slavery in America. There is this man, Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra, who writes about slavery, relatively speaking. Early on in South Africa, 1902 or 3 or so, Gandhi does write about slavery in America in very strong terms. He writes in his journal, Indian Opinion, that he started, he writes about Booker T. Washington, one of the great African-American leaders. Of course, Gandhi writes about this man. He wants the Indians of South Africa to learn and be inspired by Booker T. Washington. He writes about Lincoln and Lincoln's fight against slavery when everybody was against, when Gandhi says even the religious people were defending slavery, but Lincoln absolutely fought this when he wanted that example. So this was his attitude against racism, against slavery, very strong in America. But he did make those unfortunate remarks. Okay. And we know about them because they are there in the collected works. It's not that somebody else has discovered the remark. See, Gandhi is saying he's against racism. No, it is he. He is the source of our knowledge that these unfortunate remarks were made. One other statement that Gandhi made in 1908 in Johannesburg, and this is for all scholars against racism or of racism. It's a very important statement he makes in Johannesburg in 1908. It can be found in the collected works. It was published in the newspapers in South Africa at that time. It's not something that defenders of Gandhi have now invented. It was published in 1908 in South Africa, where Gandhi says that a time must come when all the races of the world, and he mentions the Africans, and he mentions the Chinese, he mentions, of course, the Indians and the whites, the so-called colors, the mixed race people, all the races of the world, the time will come when they will commingle. And commingling is a very, very clear word. It was known, the meaning of the word commingling was known at the time. It means intermarriage, and the blood is mixing with people. So in 1908, Gandhi writes, or says in South Africa, and it's published in newspapers there, that in South Africa, the different races have the chance to create a civilization, which will be a fantastic example for the world. So far from being a racist, Gandhi made that pioneering statement before anybody in India, any other Indian in South Africa made that statement. So this too is to be understood. So, and there's one other remark I will make here. People have forgotten him, but he was a remarkable man called Albert Luthuli. He was a Nobel Prize winner in 1960 or 61. He was the president of this African National Congress in many decades later. Mandela and Tutu got the Nobel Prize, but Luthuli. Now Mandela has described, and this is there in texts that are known, he calls Luthuli a passionate disciple of Gandhi. Luthuli is a passionate disciple of Gandhi. And there is a statement by Luthuli, which is preserved in the Luthuli Museum in South Africa, where Luthuli says, and this was a statement made by Luthuli in 1948. This is not a statement made to prove that Gandhi was not a racist. It's a statement made in 1948 when Luthuli said that Gandhi's fight in South Africa for the Indians of South Africa helped African leaders in their fight in South Africa. So even though Gandhi did not directly take part in the fight for African rights, the Gandhi-inspired fight for Indian rights in South Africa led to, and Chief Luthuli especially mentions a man called John Dube, D-U-B-E, who was one of the founders of the African National Congress. He says in particular that unlike Dube, were inspired by what Gandhi did. So anyway. So now on Periyar. Yes, Periyar is all the Periyar literature has this statement from Periyar. This is a statement that was made when Gandhi was assassinated. Periyar was very deeply impacted by that assassination, and he felt that India should be named Gandhi Nadu. But it's also true that Periyar was very disappointed that Gandhi was not frontally and directly attacking caste, and that Gandhi had made some statements in defense of Varnashrama Dharma. And so Periyar was very unhappy about it. And he felt that under Gandhi's leadership, the Congress was not being radical enough over caste. So this is, and I think this is true, just as in South Africa, Gandhi did not lead a fight directly for African rights. During the freedom movement, Gandhi certainly very strongly spoke about untouchability, very passionately spoke about untouchability. But it's true that he did not directly tackle the caste system, and sometimes he made statements that could be seen as some kind of defense of the caste system. But if you examine those statements, every one of those, Gandhi is defending the Varnashrama Dharma, but he's also saying that this is only an ideal in an ideal state. He's either stating directly or implying clearly that that ideal is certainly not being practiced today. But Gandhi needs the caste Hindus for his freedom movement. And he needs them also for his other great goal. He wants a Hindu-Muslim partnership. And he cannot make enemies of the caste Hindus because he has to get India's independence along with others. So Gandhi, as he himself has said, that that sometimes he emphasizes fight against untouchability, sometimes he emphasizes Hindu-Muslim unity, sometimes he says we will have non-cooperation, we will have campaigns. So this is where context is important. So, but nonetheless, Periyar, to understand his life, in 1919, 1920, he became an absolutely passionate Gandhi associate, a passionate fighter for non-cooperation, which Gandhi called for. But then he felt that Gandhi was not tackling the caste situation directly enough. In Gandhi's case, Gandhi felt that he, is my understanding, my reading, and those who have studied Gandhi's life also know that in the latter part of his life, he radicalized himself. He started speaking in radical terms on caste also, and he started advocating inter-caste marriage. In fact, he said he will only bless a marriage where one person was a Dalit and the other person. So in my understanding, and I think it's a fair understanding, Gandhi had to adjust the intensity of his campaigns depending on what was needed from a broad angle. But Periyar was disappointed. Periyar felt that, and here we also know that in the Tamil country where Periyar was and he remains such a loved and popular figure, the caste equations are particularly, you might say, sharp. And so Periyar felt that Gandhi should have been more direct. And we also know that in 1939, as the war starts, challenging issues before the Congress of how to respond to it. That is when, for a brief time, Periyar, Jinnah, and Ambedkar, all three, toyed briefly with the idea of an anti-Congress alliance all across. But then Periyar, in my understanding, Periyar retained his very deep love for Gandhi, admiration for Gandhi, which coexisted with a deep disappointment that Gandhi did not make direct assaults on the caste system part of his agenda. So now, are there other Gandhi-related points that you want me to answer?
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. I think not at the moment.
Okay.
Let me move on to the other set of questions,
yes.
Which are also some of the issues that you have written about in many places, which is about Muslim political thought.
Yes.
And here, broadly speaking, I will read out the questions, but broadly speaking, they refer to three individuals. One is Jinnah, two is Iqbal, and three is Fazlul Haq. And I will just read out the questions for the benefit of everybody. The first question says, in understanding the Muslim mind, you wrote, quote, it was Jinnah's historic role to achieve Pakistan, but his belief in a Muslim homeland was not as unqualified as Iqbal's, unquote. And the question reads, did Jinnah's opinions on Millat differ from that of Iqbal? That's one. The second one, which also relates to Iqbal's thought, says, how was Fazlul Haq's concept of a Muslim homeland different from Iqbal's? And finally, the third question, which relates directly to Iqbal, says, on the New Year's Day in 1938, Iqbal, the Universalist, spoke from the Lahore station of All India Radio, quote, only one unity is dependable, and that unity is the brotherhood of man, which is above race, nationality, color, or language. So long as men do not demonstrate by their actions that they believe that the whole world is the family of God, the beautiful ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity will never materialize. Unquote. And the question says, was Iqbal in the process of reconciliation with his earlier positions in his final years? So we would love to hear from you about how you see the political thoughts and the changes within them for these three very important political individuals. Professor Gandhi.
Well, thank you for this fascinating set of questions. And it is really very useful to keep in our minds these three very interesting figures, more or less contemporaneous figures, Jinnah, Fazlul Haq, and Iqbal, and find out a bit more about them. Now, this again is obvious truth, but sometimes we forget this. That every individual is representative of he has some identities, religious or ethnic or racial, national, whatever. And some identities come to the fore at different times, other identities come to the fore at another time. But it's important to note that Fazlul Haq was a very powerful leader of Bengal, but of Bengali Muslims in particular. And although himself was born in a fairly comfortable landlord's family, he became, for some periods of his life, leader of the peasantry also in East Bengal, Bangladesh. And although West Bengal did not have a Muslim majority, Bengal as a whole at that time did have a Muslim majority. So Fazlul Haq was you might say, let's call him a Bengali Muslim leader in a Muslim majority region. Likewise, Iqbal was a Punjabi Muslim leader in a Muslim majority region. But Jinnah was different. Although he was born in Karachi, he was born to a Gujarati-speaking family in Karachi. And then for much of his life, he was either in Bombay or in Delhi. And so neither Bombay nor Delhi were Muslim majority areas. And certainly Jinnah wanted to represent, to speak for, not only the Muslims of the Muslim majority areas that eventually became Pakistan, but also for the Muslims of Hindu majority areas. So this was a great difference, which conditioned, you might say, the political stances at different times of these three. So this is something worth recognizing and remembering when we think of these three different figures. Now, Fazlul Haq, what a seesaw in his life, seesaws in his life, but incredible personality. And yes, he was premier of all of Bengal for a time, and then governor of East Bengal afterwards. But people do know, those who read history, that he moved the resolution for Pakistan on March 23, 1940, as the premier of Bengal in Lahore. And but later, of course, he became a very big opponent of Jinnah's, and became one of the symbols of Bangla nationalism, or as distinct from some kind of Muslim nationalism. Iqbal, on the other hand, and there it's important also to note, apart from the fact that he came from Muslim majority Punjab, that Iqbal, unlike Jinnah and Fazlul Haq, was not a 100% politician. He took part in politics. He made political pronouncements, but primarily he was a poet. Primarily he was a dreamer. And yes, he had very clear political views too at different times. And I think that the lines that were quoted in the question towards the end of his life, Iqbal died in 1938, and shortly before he died, he made that amazing statement about all the people of the world of the respective religions, which was quoted. It's an inspiring statement. But of course, we know that after he wrote his famous Sare Jahan Se Achha, then he goes to Europe, and he returns from Europe a completely different point of view. So now, instead of being an Indian first, he's a Muslim first. And And his picture of the Muslim Qawm all over the world, the universal Islamic community, seems to take precedence in his mind. But then, as the questioner said, that towards the end he makes that statement. But that does not mean that Iqbal has renounced his earlier ideas either. And this too, I think, is what we should. So we should not judge a person's views by one statement. So did Iqbal in the end become reconciled to a Hindu-Muslim partnership and to united India? We can't quite say yes to that on the basis of a statement like that. But that statement is important to recognize. And I think, so like most people, Iqbal too lived with inconsistencies. Fazlul Haq lived with inconsistencies. Jinnah too lived with inconsistencies. After saying that Hindus and Muslims are two nations, that well-known statement of his of August 11, 1947, where he says after Pakistan has been conceded and Pakistan is about to be started, and Jinnah is to be the head of state, Governor General, and he says that in his Pakistan, everybody will be equal, religion will be a purely personal matter. But then that statement was the total opposite of his passionate statements from 1940 onwards, for 7 years, as Hindus and Muslims as two separate nations. So inconsistencies were part of the lives of these three very interesting people.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. There's actually one more question that I might mention in this context, which is about Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan.
Yes.
And the question asks, it's about his identity as a Pakhtun leader. And the question reads that if the identity of Badshah Khan as a Pakhtun drive him away from other social groups of the larger Muslim community who weren't Pakhtuns. We would love to hear your response to that.
It's a very interesting and a very important question, because it is no doubt anybody who has studied Badshah Khan's life knows what is the absolute passion for the Pakhtun people. The Pathans, as they used to be called, now they're called Pakhtuns or Pashtuns. And they are in Pakistan, they are in Afghanistan. And many of them don't recognize the Durand line which divides Afghanistan from Pakistan. So there's no doubt that although Badshah Khan was an absolutely front figure in the fight for India's freedom from British rule, so he was a very great leader of undivided India. At the same time, he was a very passionate Pakhtun, and when he was offered the presidency of the Indian National Congress, he turned it down in 34 or 35, because he didn't want to get too entangled in affairs all across India. He wanted to focus on his Pakhtuns. And the focus on his Pakhtuns, now the Pakhtuns whom he loved deeply, and for whom he made incredible sacrifices all his long life. And they were his bridge to the rest of humanity, because he knew his Pakhtuns, and through the Pakhtuns he then got to know all of humanity. But yes, the Pakhtuns were his absolutely immediate and passionate, and you might say his priority. Then there was his Islam. So Pakhtun was, you might say, his race, and Islam was his religion. But you can't always separate the two, but it is true that his deep love of the Pakhtuns, probably unparalleled love for the Pakhtuns, was a source of some tension and some conflict between the Pakhtuns and, say, the Punjabi Muslims, or even the Punjabis of Pakistan, the Sindhis of Pakistan, and the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, and the Tajiks in Afghanistan, and the other Uzbeks and the Hazaras. So this does not mean that Badshah Khan entertained any enmity or dislike of these other neighboring ethnicities. But there is no doubt that because the Pakhtuns were his number one concern, it became a source of tension and of potential division and conflict with neighboring ethnicities.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. There is a set of questions about Chakravarti Rajagopalachari. 3 to be precise. at the moment. The first one says, I'll just read it out for everybody, that in modern South Asia, you have mentioned that in 1942, Rajagopalachari resigned from the Congress as well as the Assembly. You also added that, quote, he, and with references to M.K. Gandhi, added that Patel wanted Rajagopalachari to vacate his assembly seat, unquote. And it seems from your book that there were differences within the Congress on the issue of Quit India. And as mentioned, Rajagopalachari opposed it and wanted a settlement. What may have been the reasons behind his stance? So this is the first question. The second one says, during the 1940 to 47 period, what was the relationship between the TNCC and the INC? Especially in the context of Rajagopalachari, although being a popular leader on the National Front, did face many setbacks within the TNCC. And finally, the last question on the subject says that we know that Chakravarti Rajagopalachari proposed a formula to solve the political turmoil between the Muslim League and the INC. And the question asks your views on the formula itself and how it might have played a role in the crisis or the solution or the political dynamics of the times. We would love to know your views about this.
I'll try. So I'll start with the last maybe first. So this CR formula something like this, that this was put forward in 42, 43, 44 kind of time, and it was the basis of the Gandhi-Jinnah talks of September 44. And Jinnah rejected that. The formula was that, Pakistan demand at one stage, Jinnah was underlining it, that all the Muslim majority provinces, which meant that all of Bengal and all of Punjab, including today's West Bengal, including today's Punjab, today's Indian Haryana, and today's Indian Himachal, which were all part of undivided Punjab. Because Punjab was undivided, and as British Punjab, it had a Muslim majority. So the Muslim League claimed that the Muslim majority areas should become separate. And therefore, all of Punjab, all of Bengal. And Assam too was made part of the demand, should become part of the Pakistan area. So the CR formula was that Muslim majority districts, if they were next to each other and if they were contiguous and in one part, say in northwestern part or eastern part, yes, it makes sense. The Muslim majority districts could come together. And if there's a plebiscite and everybody votes, and if they want to be separate, then they could be separated. So not the entire provinces, but Muslim majority districts could be separated, and after a plebiscite. And also that once there is a separation, that there should be some kind of bonds of agreement or treaty between, say, the Pakistan area and the rest of the Indian area, so that there would be a separation, but there would be some bonds of agreement, some linkage. So this is very roughly. So on paper, it sounded and still sounds a very reasonable idea. But Jinnah did not agree to that, and he felt that and behind Jinnah's rejection, we don't know for sure, but behind Jinnah's rejection was his keenness to represent not only the Muslims of Muslim majority areas, but also Muslims of the whole country. And because he rejected this seemingly reasonable, seemingly fair idea, this was one reason why Gandhi made his famous suggestion just before partition was accepted by everybody, that maybe Jinnah should be offered the Prime Ministership of United India. This was never put to Jinnah. And Nehru and Patel very strongly objected to this. So Gandhi discussed this with Mountbatten. And so anyway, that's a separate story. So, but because Jinnah really had this dilemma throughout his life, ultimately he then, you might say, sacrificed the Muslims of India, and he said he would be content with what he called small Pakistan. So at least on paper, but what sounds reasonable on paper can't always be accepted by everybody, because all kinds of political realities, economic realities, other realities come in the way. So that is my response to the last point. Now, yes, so CR is certainly in the 20s, 30s, 40s, a very prominent national figure in India. The Indian National Congress, the Indian Freedom Movement has many attractive figures, but CR is one of these striking figures. And so he brings a very interesting element to the national scene. He's a brilliant debater and all that, and he brings a South Indian face to the national scene. But within the Tamil country, within South India, CR is seen as a Brahmin. And so there is a very strong opposition to him. And there's also a feeling that he's also not radical enough on the question of caste, is too conservative or whatever. And so the TNCC, as has been mentioned, had many critics of Rajagopalachari. And eventually Kamaraj was one of his main, you might say, opponents within the Congress in South India. And so the question is quite right that CR's acceptance across India and his stature across India was not always matched within the Tamil area, although he was chief minister, or premier as used to be called once or twice. So then, what was the other question about CR? Yes, on Quit India, very important question. There again, I mentioned that in the case of Jinnah, Iqbal and Fazlul Haq, that we need to know which part of India they came from. So similarly, Rajagopalachari comes from Madras, which then, also included the Telugu area, and the Madras presidency, as it used to be called, had a very long east coast line. And when Japan had conquered much of Southeast Asia, Japan was very close to the east coast boundary of India. And in some cases, bombs also were dropped in parts of the east coast. So that also was a big factor in Rajagopalachari's reaction to the Second World War. So Rajagopalachari saw the Japanese threat in a more acute way than some others did. This was a factor. And then also he, in his estimate, he thought that because of the danger from Japan, the British Empire would be more willing to give freedom, or if not completely, large steps towards freedom in 42-43. In fact, this was not the case. History has shown that Churchill was absolutely opposed to this, and that Gandhi and others who felt that the British, who therefore Gandhi launched Quit India. But Rajagopalachari nursed the idea that because of the danger from Japan, of which he was acutely conscious by virtue of the fact that he belonged to that east coast of South India, and that, but he felt that this was a chance to explore a settlement with the British in view of the Japanese threat, and he somewhat unrealistically thought that the British would be willing to grant substantial steps towards independence. So I don't know whether I've covered all the points. But
I think so. Let me now come to the final set of questions that I've received, and this will sort of take us back to your journey as an intellectual over the years.
Yeah.
There are two, to be precise, and then I will take the liberty of asking one more, perhaps, if there is time.
Please.
The two that I have received, the two questions, I'll read them out. Besides teaching history, you also worked as a journalist. Do you think your career in journalism has had an impact on your history writing? That is one. And the second, very much related to this, uh, it reads, during the emergency, your weekly journal, Himmat, which you mentioned also today earlier, was quite active. Did this have a role in your later academic pursuits? That's it.
Okay. So, people may try to make assessments of other people, but they don't often make assessments about themselves. And so I can't fully, if I take time over it, maybe I will try to find some connection between, say, my journalism and my study of history. Yes. Also, there's one obvious point, perhaps, which I should make, that a journalist, by virtue of his profession or her profession, has to be concise and clear. So, to the extent that if my history writing is also reasonably concise and reasonably clear, that may have something to do also with my journalistic. That's a very minor point. Now, it's also true that during the emergency, when my friends and colleagues and I were producing this journal called Himmat in Bombay, the emergency came, and so emergency was a jolt. So when a jolt happens, then you are inclined to think of the longer period, both the past and the future. Jolt is a very, so that way, my journalistic experience at that time did, you might say, push me towards history also. And in a very practical way, there was some kind of pre-censorship or censorship, and you couldn't write about current events. But sometimes we used historical examples. So we wrote about history to make an indirect but quite an obvious connection to current events. So that also connected journalism to history, and the emergency at that time. So those are some reactions I have to the question of journalism and history.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. And if I may add a little to that, because I don't think we have any other questions at the moment, but perhaps a few more minutes to spare. I was wondering about the two approaches that you have taken to thinking about the past. One, of course, is the writing of biographies as a means of thinking about the past, and the other is the route of thinking in terms of regions. You've written about Punjab, you've written about South Asia, and of course, in terms of biography, we have already mentioned the several biographies that you have written. And I was wondering about the advantages of thinking about the past using two very different methodological routes. Or, if I might pose it as a question, that although thinking through in terms of a region and thinking through a biography might seem very different to us, is writing about a region also a form of writing a biography of a region? So, is it really two methods that you have been following, or is it largely one? And what are some of the challenges and some of the advantages of thinking about the past through this biographical approach, be it of a person or be it of a region?
Now, I will preface my responses by saying that in my case, when I wrote my biographies to begin with, I did not say to myself, I will try to write history. And to write history, I will take the biographical route. I was asked, as I mentioned, by these admirers of Rajagopalachari whether I would write a biography. I was a journalist. So I wrote the biography. Afterwards, I can try and figure out that biography writing may also be useful for understanding history. One biography that has not been mentioned is my biography of Vallabhbhai Patel, which is Ghaffar Khan, of course. So, and these 8 Muslim leaders, of course, were all. But yes, soon I began to understand, since, and this again is only a limited approach. It's not necessarily a sufficient approach, a biographical, but the people that I've written about, there's Jinnah, there's Patel, there is Ghaffar Khan, there is Iqbal, Maulana Azad, and Maulana Muhammad Ali, of course Gandhi I wrote this big biography of. So, it is my great regret that I have not managed to write about Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, Rabindranath Tagore, Ambedkar. These are people that I would have loved. If now somebody suggested I should try and write about undivided Bengal, it would be a privilege to do so. But here, let me make a slightly different point, not directly in response to your question, but I have long felt that it's too late for me to do it. But somebody should attempt a unified history of Eastern Indian subcontinent. By that I mean, in particular, I mean unified history of today's West Bengal, today's Bangladesh, today's Northeast India, into because parts of Burma are also involved in the story. But I think we cannot understand Bengal without understanding Bangladesh. We cannot understand Bangladesh without understanding Assam. We cannot understand the Nagas without understanding the Bengalis, and the Khasis or the Manipuris. People in all these regions have their own pictures of the past, their own maps of the past, how politics played out in the past. But somebody, or it could be a group of people, to understand really the interrelationships. Now, each of these cultures is very rich. This area that I've mentioned has so many very rich cultures. But each of these cultures is terribly interdependent on neighboring cultures, interconnected with, and sometimes has a very cordial relationship, sometimes has a difficult relationship. But I humbly submit, and this is true partly because of the experience I had of doing the history of undivided Punjab and the history of large South India. I feel that all of the Northeast and of Bengal together would be, and Bangladesh would be a challenging, but perhaps a very worthwhile. Now, your question is a very interesting one, that really, even when one studies a region, one is trying to write a biography of the region. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And so the development, the emergence, the growth, the tensions as time passes in each region, the new tensions that are introduced, new dreams that are harbored. So I would say that even to understand, or for the sake of the future also, now we want relations between Bangladesh and northeast of India, Bangladesh and West Bengal. Nepal is very important, by the way, not to be forgotten. So, or connected. So, I would say that the biography of the region, especially if we exclude nobody. Now, this is almost an impossible task. You can't write about every single person in a region to take a few million years to write that. But one can make an attempt at approximation and inclusion of as much history, as much emotion, as much attachment, as much devotion, as much energy of the different areas as possible. So this is part of my response, perhaps a very
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. And as I think we are going to take a couple of questions from the audience, but perhaps in the meantime, I was wondering what your current projects are. What are you working on these days?
For the first time in a very long time, I'm not working on any biographical or historical project at the moment, although I have many things I would like to, and for a very simple reason that, like many, I'm also pulled by the current challenges to democracy in many parts of the world, including India. And so much of my emotion, much of my energy, my time also goes into, if possible, encouraging those who I feel are putting up the necessary fight to protect democratic rights. So that has, for the time being, taken precedence over any kind of scholarly study of any person or area in particular.
Right. And given that we have a lot of history students today who have tuned in to listen to this conversation, do you have a message for them as a sort of master craftsman? Uh, Especially at a time when history as a discipline is facing all sorts of challenges, from especially from powers that be, not only in India but also in different other parts of the world. And as young students of history and early career faculty members, we also face this existential crisis at some points that, is what we are doing at all relevant? Does it matter at all? We would love to hear what you think of all of this.
That's a great question. And I would say that, although I have said that I myself find myself drawn to or pulled by other more immediate needs, it does not at all mean that a scholarly study of history is irrelevant or unhelpful. I would say that history is so much, it's obviously a weapon in so many of the battles, sometimes divisive battles that are being waged. Therefore, courageous understanding of history where poison is not encouraged. The truth is undoubtedly faced, but where hatred is not encouraged. So I think those are very great challenges. And so history students have a tremendous role to play, and historians, to present the past with all its pain, all its ugliness, all its cruelty, but yet also to discover and present those who have opposed cruelty, those who have fought for justice, those who have fought for equality, those who have fought for mercy, fought for goodwill, for compassion. So, so I think, just to give a very concrete example, one point that is insufficiently understood, people are deeply troubled about today's toxicity. But people have forgotten that in 46, 47, 48, India's climate was just as toxic because terrible killings had taken place. And all those who have studied even a modicum of fairness know that cruelty was perpetrated by all sides, on all sides. That nobody can blame that either one particular religious group or was better or worse. Horrible things were done. And that toxicity Well, Jinnah, to begin with, said that Pakistan would be a state for everybody. Very soon, Pakistan became some kind of an Islamic state. In 46, 47, 48, the climate in India was such that India could easily have become not a state for all, but a state for the majority. But it did not. And the courageous way which Gandhi and Nehru, Gandhi did, and then others, many others, soon Ambedkar became part of this national team. And so that is a very remarkable story. It was not a predictable story. This was not an inevitable story. It was not the natural course. Because history happens, we think that history happened, in an automatic, natural way. No. The emergence and launching of Free India as a secular state for all who live in India was an amazing achievement, and it is an unstudied achievement. Many people played a part in that. So I'd like today's historians, if they may have other interests, of course, everybody should be governed by her or his heart. He has so much richness to tap. But this is one area that I would recommend for the energetic attention of the best young historian.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. And with your permission, we could take perhaps a couple of questions that have come in from the audience before we wrap up.
Yeah.
So, Professor Amit Dey asks, Gandhi and Azad read Shibli Nomani's writings on the Prophet and the Caliphs and welcomed a modern multi-religious society. What was the response of Muslim League rulers to Shibli's writings? I particularly would be interested to know about Jinnah and Iqbal's responses.
Well, now I can't say that I've studied Jinnah from that angle, or that I know what his response was to Shibli's writings. But I would know from the rest of his life, I would be willing to state on the basis of what I know about the rest of his life that he would have been totally uninterested in Shibli's writings. And Jinnah was aware of political trends always, and he was willing to modify his position depending on strength of feeling in various groups. To that extent, he kept himself extremely well posted on what was happening. But I don't think Shibli's writings would have attracted his direct attention. Iqbal's would have, but I think there again, let us remember, I go back to the point I made. Shibli, represents what might be called Muslim minority in India. Iqbal represents Muslim majority. That makes a very large difference in the response. And so this is the limited response I would like to make.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. And the other question that we have is from Sukhdev Sohal, who says that the 1920s were full of communal violence and riots in the Punjab. Lala Lajpat Rai wrote about the reorganization of the Punjab on religious grounds, and Iqbal's views also changed with time. And he would love to know your response to, I think, both the political processes but the intellectual facts also.
Very, very good questions. And it is true, and most people don't remember this, but it is true that in 1924, Lala Lajpat Rai proposed the partition of Punjab. Because in the eastern Punjab, where the Hindus and Sikhs were in the majority and the Muslims were in the minority, and Lala Lajpat Rai, because he was living in Lahore, he felt that eastern Punjab should be made a separate. He proposed a partition of undivided Punjab in 1924. Very significant. So it was some kind of acceptance that difficult for Hindus and Sikhs to live under Muslim majority rule and Muslims to live under non-Muslim majority. It's 1924. So, so Lala Lajpat Rai was always conscious of the difficulty of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims to live together. But there were different times in his life when he felt that they could and they would. And he took a tremendous part in the first non-cooperation movement. And he has spoken with great amazement and pride, I think, that period of non-cooperation movement. People like him could speak from the pulpit of a mosque, of the Badshahi Mosque in Lahore, biggest mosque in India. So Lala Lajpat Rai was also familiar with the possibility of great common coexistence, partnership, joint fight of everybody in India against imperialism, but he was also aware of the difficulty of different groups living with complete harmony. So he did propose in 1924 the partition of Punjab. And so likewise, Iqbal also changed with time. It's correct. So Iqbal, in 1930, he proposed that there should be a northwestern. He didn't think of the eastern part of India at all at the time. He spoke of the eastern majority provinces, but he was, from what I know, he was also seemed willing to consider detaching the eastern Punjab also from his area. Yes, Iqbal also, but then we know that he, near the end of his time, he was also thinking of other possibilities of partnership. So both Lala Lajpat, and incidentally, I think Lala Lajpat Rai is also a very, very remarkable figure. We should not underestimate his importance, his wisdom. You know that he was in the United States during the years of the First World War, and he made many contacts with the African American leaders. Many people don't know this. So he's a very important figure also to study.
I think we can take a couple of more questions perhaps before ending, if that's fine with you, Professor.
Certainly.
As somebody who knows very little about the 20th century, I must say that today's conversations have been extremely enlightening for me, to have this conversation with you, because I work mainly on the 16th and 17th centuries, and this has been a very learning experience for me. One more question that we have received is, how would you explain M.K. Gandhi's views on self-sufficient village economy? This question comes from Devajrita Patra.
Yes, well, thanks for that important question. Gandhi's views on the village economy were the result of several considerations. One, of course, was that he was aware that the way in which the imperialist rule was established in India was through the destruction of India's village economy, the artisans, the weavers. And so this was a very important factor in his emergence of his views. And another was his awareness that the bulk of India lived in villages, and it was not possible to move them to cities. Employment had to be given to them where they were. He knew that every Indian was a consumer. He wanted also the Indian to be a producer, if possible. And so this was his rationale for his belief that there should be village industries, spinning, of course, and weaving, many other things, leather, cloth, and carpentry. There was a list of numerous village industries that he felt could be attempted in villages. He just couldn't see how India quickly becoming industrialized in a capital-intensive sense. He just couldn't see that. So he felt that the villages should find employment. It's also important to note that in his picture of the ideal village, and he and Nehru had some interesting conversations. Nehru gave his view that villages are backward and how can you really build the future of it. So Gandhiji disagreed with that view. But he also said that he imagined theater, stage, and play area in every village. So he wanted the village to become sophisticated. As you know very well, in the Western world, to live in a village is a privilege. To live in a city is not. And villages are preferred places. They're beautiful places. And there's no reason why lovers of, you might say, rural India should be defensive about it, because villages can and ought to be made not only productive, not only providing employment, but ideally it should be culturally sophisticated. And I think this is also part of Gandhi's picture of self-sufficient village.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi. And the final couple of questions both relate to M.K. Gandhi. Debojyoti Mondol asks how you would explain Gandhi's idea of ahimsa in accordance with the contemporary world. But if my reading of the question is correct, it's probably about the relevance, if I'm not mistaken, of the concept of ahimsa in the contemporary world, perhaps. And Sujata Chakravarti asks, personal religious beliefs can have no place in national politics. The question is that was Gandhi completely neutral in this case? Meaning probably whether or not Gandhi's own religious beliefs influenced his politics. And she asks you to give a few examples whether he was or wasn't in this regard.
Thank you for these two very important questions. So I think it's important, as far as Gandhi's ahimsa is concerned, to recognize something that is generally forgotten. Many people imagine that Gandhi's ahimsa was absolute and limitless. So Gandhiji never said that if somebody is attacking a weak person, your family, your wife, your children, that you should be helpless and not them to do this. He repeatedly said that if you did not have a non-violent way of protecting others, you must use force to protect the weak and vulnerable. During the killings of 47, and some Sikhs said, what about non-violence? What about kirpan? Should we not have the kirpan? Should we not use the kirpan? Gandhi said, yes, the kirpan certainly can be used. But said kirpan adorns its possessor only when it is used against odds to protect the weak. So a weapon is useful if it is used for protecting the weak against attacks. This is an important understanding of Gandhi's ahimsa. It was not an absolute abandonment of all use of force to use of force to protect is absolutely in accordance with Gandhi's himself. But the use of force to bully the weak, to intimidate, to coerce people is, of course, absolutely wrong in Gandhi's view. Now, I would say that if you understand Gandhi's ahimsa in its proper context, and it is not an unqualified, absolute abandonment of use of force. And then non-violence also is a force. Ahimsa and satyagraha is a direct action. People forget that ahimsa satyagraha was a fight against British imperialism. So it was a fight. It was a fight. So ahimsa was, so Gandhi said, and many people agreed, that quite apart from principles of killing and killing, against powerful forces, if they have all the guns, they have all the big guns and big weapons, what can violence achieve? Except reprisals on you and all those you love. So in such a situation, if you don't want mere petitioning, which was humiliating, non-violent direct action was a way out. So this is how India did accept satyagraha, non-violent action as the way to fight the British rule. And this has relevance, I would say, in contemporary. Whether it's Black Lives Matter or whatever, that it may not be completely Gandhian in every way, but much of it is very, very much so. Many African American leaders have made the connection in recent weeks even about Black Lives Matter protests and Martin Luther King and nonviolent direct action. Now, on the religious belief, that's a very important question. Now, Gandhi did not feel that personal religious beliefs can have no place, right or wrong. I'm not saying that he was right or wrong. Knowing him, studying him, I know that he did not believe that personal religious beliefs can have no place. Yes, he did not want any state to impose any religious belief on the nation. That he was totally against. And he has said again and again that India would be a secular state. But he was very much himself a believer in the Almighty. And so this is a very difficult question in the world today. I mentioned earlier Tolstoy and his impact on Gandhi's life, Sermon on the Mount. So many people would say that Christianity is forgiveness, reconciliation, absolute non-violence, minimal use of violence. But there are many in the world today, in the Western world, or in other parts of the world, who would use some kind of, who would marry religious nationalism, religion with nationalism, and with violence. So, for instance, there are some in the United States who have no difficulty at all in saying that the American flag or even the Confederate flag and the Christian symbols can go together. So we know that in Islam it has happened and with Hinduism it has happened. But we also know that there are many Muslims and there are many Hindus and there are many Christians who believe in tolerance, who believe in coexistence, in partnership, partnership, joint action. Joint action also with those who in personal beliefs do not believe in a religion at all or in the Almighty. So this is, of course, one of the greatest questions in the world today and has been for centuries. People have very deep beliefs, whether they are religious beliefs or political beliefs, economic beliefs. But these then coexistence and partnership and friendship becomes difficult. Even within families, among relatives, it becomes difficult. So how to not only coexist, but to move forward despite having different beliefs is a challenge. Luckily, challenge more on questioners like the ones who asked this question than on people like me who will go along say goodbye to everybody.
Great. Thank you, Professor Gandhi, for your responses to these questions. I think it's time for us to say goodbye to you today, although there's so much more to talk about. But it's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to have you with us today. And thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Personally, I learned a lot. And also, heartfelt thanks to all the members of the audience today who tuned in this evening to listen to our conversation. And to everyone in India and the neighboring regions, I wish a very good evening, and to Professor Gandhi, a very good day. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you and goodbye to all the students who are taking part. I appreciate this introduction very much.
Thank you, and goodbye.